This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo. This week, I'm not on. My voice is just an illusion. Emmet O'Cuana will be talking with Neal Curtis from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Recently, at the Australian Centre for the Moving Image in Melbourne, Neal presented the paper Captain America, Patriotism, Nationalism, Fascism. This interview covers how the way Cap has been presented over the years has evolved in light of current events, from World War II to the War on Terror, from Watergate to the rise of Trump. And, by the way, if you're a Trump supporter, prepare to hear some contrary views. First, a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week.
Hello everyone, my name is Emmet O'Cuana, and on the line I am joined by Dr. Neal Curtis. Hello Neal, how are things?
Good, yeah, I'm fine, thank you very much.
Now, how do I introduce you? I was thinking you lecture at the University of Auckland in comics and visual narrative.
Yeah, that's the graduate course, yeah.
You're currently working on a book called Sovereignty and Superheroes for Manchester University Press.
Well, that's actually out. That came out.
Oh!
That came out last year.
Very good, okay. You need to update your website. And we are going to be talking about Captain America, the function of Captain America as a political symbol, which I saw you present a paper on here in Melbourne just over a month ago now at the Superhero Identities Symposium in Acme.
Yeah, that was a really good conference. I loved that.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. While I've given sort of an overview, even though I got the book date wrong for you, what's your actual academic research? What's your current field?
Well, I suppose I'm still researching comics, and after the book, I mean, I suppose I'm waiting for a paperback to come out this year. So, but yeah, after that book, I was thinking of getting away from superheroes actually, and just going back to talking about comics more generally. But I can't sort of do it. I've got a few papers that I want to write, so I'm particularly interested in. I'm still kind of quite obsessed about this idea of sovereignty in relation to superheroes and questions of the law and violence. And even since I published that book, I've been engaged with a couple of articles that came out just after I'd submitted the manuscript, I think. And they kind of helped me to sort of crystallize what it was I was trying to say about superheroes as sovereigns rather than vigilantes. So I'm kind of want to explore that a bit more. I've just published an article on Wonder Woman and the change to her origin story that Brian Azzarello did, which I wasn't very happy with. So that's just been published with the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics, and an essay on sovereignty in Marvel's Secret Wars event. That's going to be published by the Comics Grid. I've got another piece out with a colleague, hopefully. We're revising it on superheroes and third wave feminism. So I'm quite interested in that sort of intervention that's taking place in superheroes at the moment around diversity.
So Miss Marvel, stuff like that.
Yeah, well, the whole range of it, really. Even the most recent thing that came out, I don't know if you've read it yet. If you haven't, you must do. The Unstoppable Wasp came out last month. Yeah. Absolutely brilliant. Yeah. It's a fantastic little feminist take on superheroes. She's the daughter of Hank Pym, and she was brought up in Russia like the Black Widow. But she's just brilliant. It's amazing. There's a great relationship with her and Mockingbird in issue 1. I won't tell you about it, but you've got to read it. It's the sort of thing that will put a smile on your face and make you feel good.
And I think what I find interesting about your mentioning of Wonder Woman there as well, beyond her being a feminist symbol, and she's been adopted as a feminist symbol, I was always very interested in how the character of Wonder Woman sort of anticipated Captain America's use of the American national flag as part of her costume. And that's actually used in story, in the actual script for the original Wonder Woman. She is draping herself in the flag of America because she wants to represent the best values of America.
Yeah, and of course it's a wartime story when it came out, right? Yeah. And she is a sort of a national figure in that sense. She's chosen to live in man's world, which in the comics is pretty much America, right? Mm-hmm. So she's chosen to take up home there and fight for her ideals by transforming man's world, right? But she sees that America is sort of the best part of man's world, or she can see that America is trying to do what she wants to do as well, right? Yeah. For peace, right? Yeah. She sees America in terms of peace as opposed to the Nazis, which is Ares and war, right? So in the comics, she naturally identifies with America because she sees them as the peaceful nation in relation to the aggressor, right? That's interesting for her as a national figure, I think.
Well, as I mentioned, I attended the conference and I saw you give your paper on Captain America and the idea of Captain America as a nationalist symbol. Now, it was a very interesting time, and I think it's become even more frantically interesting since you gave your paper because you heavily alluded to Trump and Trump's use of populism as a way of getting onto the presidential electoral stage. So, do you want to speak to your paper briefly, just in terms of what the genesis of it was and what you were trying to say with it?
Well, it started with Nick Spencer bringing Steve Rogers back as Captain America. Yeah. I was really disappointed, actually, at first, because he picked up Sam Wilson, Captain America, 6 months before, and he really gave him a strong identity as Captain America, right? Which he'd sort of been Captain America for a while, but nobody had really given him an identity, and he'd done remarkably well. And of course, the first issue of it was a very, very anti-Trump comic, the Sam Wilson Captain America one, where he ends up saving illegal immigrants from right-wing vigilantes called the Serpent Society down on the Mexican border, right? And this was at the time when Trump was going through the primaries and talking about a wall and talking about immigration and sort of really developing his far-right racist rhetoric. So this was a direct engagement with Trump, right, and Sam Wilson. And so he and Marvel decided to bring Steve Rogers back for the 75th anniversary, and I was a bit pissed off because I thought, what better for the 75th anniversary of Captain America than to have a black Captain America, right? Yeah. Given the Black Lives Matter and all the other shit that was going down over there. So it was like, oh God, why have they brought him back? But then I read that first issue and it was like, oh my God, what's he done, right? Because we all know now he turned him into a Hydra agent, and he's always been a Hydra agent, and so Cap was basically a Nazi, and of course the internet went absolutely insane about it with the sort of say no to Hydra Cap hashtag on Twitter and stuff. And I sort of wrote a piece to try and defend it, because what I was saying was that Nick Spencer is thinking that fascism is no longer abroad, right? Captain America doesn't have to go abroad to fight the fascists, right? They're not alien and foreign. Fascism in the form of Trump is now at the heart of the body politic of America. And how better to express this than actually make Captain America a fascist, right? So this was just a different way of doing it, right? So that kind of started me thinking about it. I mean, there's a chapter in the book on Captain America and patriotism. So it was really kind of, the idea came out of the research I'd done already around Captain America on nationalism and patriotism and stuff. So it's just something I wanted to talk about, really.
Do you feel that this use of the character is almost a natural development of the symbolism of Captain America, or is it more sort of immediately reflective of what's happening now?
It's difficult. I think you can see a continuity there, right? We know there's a number of occasions where Captain America has been possessed by the Red Skull, right? And he's become bad because of that possession. There was even the story. I was going to talk about this in a different context. There's that story where he gets involved with the Nazi group that are called National Force, where he's possessed, I think, or mind controlled by Dr. Faustus, who sort of turns him momentarily into a Nazi. And that was issue 234, I think. 234. So that's very interesting. And of course, more recently, we know that the Red Skull is actually a clone of Captain America, right? There's been a story where the Red Skull has been a clone. So I think throughout Captain America stories, there's this really interesting, complex relationship between friend and enemy.
Yeah.
Actually, in relation to the context of this discussion, the friend and enemy relation in Captain America comics often completely deconstructs the difference between the two.
Yeah.
Right? Where, the friend actually becomes the enemy and the enemy becomes the friend, or they switch bodies, or the fact that they are so intertwined with each other, right? That they're not easily separable. They're not easily kind of taken apart,
Yes.
This is something we saw throughout the war on terror, right? With the invasion of Iraq. That idea where you sort of try and fight the enemy, you actually become your own worst enemy, right? Because you embolden the enemy, you end up creating ISIS and so on. Do you see what I mean? So that division between friend and enemy, or the attack by Al Qaeda, right? They were former friends, right? They were funded right up until the moment of the attack, almost.
They even get a special thank you at the end of one of the Rambo films. I remember that.
Yeah. There's that scene where Ronald Reagan, I think, brings the Mujahideen into the White House and describes them as like the founding fathers. And I know Al Qaeda were a particular mutation of the Mujahideen, but it's still quite interesting that it's very difficult to completely uncouple.
Yes.
Friend and enemy,
And in that particular era, and we want to talk about the Reagan era of foreign policy. You had this shifting scale between terrorist and freedom fighter, and depending on which side they were on, they could be reclassified. Yes. Yeah,
it was a great exercise in nominalism. You just sort of gave a particular name to a particular group that you liked or you didn't like. So I think Captain America's been very interesting for that. The best example of that during the war on terror was the Winter Soldier story. And there's a moment in that where, and we probably need to talk about something else. We can come back to the details behind this, but there's a bit where Bucky, who's now become bad, right? So bad Bucky is now the Winter Soldier, right? He shoots Jack Monroe and kills him.
He was a previous...
Jack Monroe was the previous bad Bucky.
Oh.
Right?
Yes.
So, but we can talk about that later, right? We'll come back to that. But the point is, in this story, you've got good Bucky turned bad, shooting bad Bucky turned good, right?
Yeah.
And I talk about this there's a chapter on friend and enemy in the book, actually. And so there's this wonderful moment of deconstruction where you can't actually work out which side is which. And this is done throughout that story, right? That whole long arc. There's all kinds of instances where these two supposedly distinct sides collapse.
Yeah. It's interesting you raise that and this notion of friend and enemy, because in your presentation you featured a depiction of the so-called anti-Cap, and he's holding Cap down with a broken shield.
Broken shield, yeah.
He's got a jagged shield to his neck. And the art is by Bart Sears, and that's from, I think it's Captain America and the Falcon, which is the Christopher Priest, Bart Sears.
Yeah, that's actually called Two Americas.
In the collection, yeah. And what's interesting about that is when the story begins, we are told that Falcon has gone rogue.
Yeah.
Sam Wilson's gone rogue. He's gone to Guantanamo. He's broken with the government, and he's doing his own stunt there in Guantanamo. And they're sending in Cap, supposedly, to find out what's happening. And then, in typical Christopher Priest sort of tricky narrative twist, we learn that the Cap we've been following is not Cap.
Yeah.
He's anti-Cap, who's unnamed. We don't know who he is, but he's this hulking monstrosity. And Bart Sears has been depicting him with muscles up to his face. And,
it's really gratuitous art. Yeah.
Yeah, it's bizarre. But that sense of discomfort because the Cap we thought was Captain America has been doing all these horrible things.
Yeah.
And you just naturally assume, oh, I guess this is what Captain America does now.
Yeah.
And then there's a sort of final page reveal, actually it's not him, but up until that point you thought it was. And then the plot of the story actually has the real Cap confront him, and he replies, well, the times have moved on.
Yeah.
You know, in effect, if we have a place like Guantanamo where we're detaining people and torturing them, what need do we have for your idealism? What need do we have for a Captain America today?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. So the whole story is about showing the Captain America of the War on Terror, right? What Captain America is. As you just said, the Guantanamo Cap. What would he be like? And of course, that's the point of the story, right? He's made, I don't know, he's created by the Navy out of some kind of process, whether it's the sort of some aspect of the old Cap process, or I think it might be something to do with the way Luke Cage was created, or I can't quite remember now. But the whole point of the process is to turn him into an order-following assassin, right? So all of the complex reasoning and moral judgments and the difficulties that Cap would normally have in those kinds of situations are removed, because you're either with us or against us, right? It's a time where there is no grey area, right? So Cap, who tends to make things quite complex because of his independent thinking and his use of a range of sort of moral principles, is no longer required in the War on Terror, right? It's a very, very stark statement that what we are doing, we don't need Captain America for. We need just this assassin that's as strong and as indestructible as him, but we don't need the old Cap. We need a new, just murderous assassin that will do what he's told in this time when there is only us or them. Kill or be killed, right? So yeah, it's very stark. And of course, Captain America has to take him down, because Captain America has to come back to show people that that is not actually patriotism according to the American ideal, right? It's something quite distinct from that, right? Because the American ideal is not just based on force and strength, right?
But it's interesting, the idea of the identity of Cap being used to legitimize that kind of violence. And maybe we can extend that to how America justifies what it does by saying, well, we're America. We're doing it for the right reasons.
Yeah, and I think that's the fact that, you know, he has this nationalist patronym, you know, he is Captain America. He's always an avatar for the nation, right? Rather than just being Steve Rogers, the superhero. He's always this avatar or an allegory for the condition of the nation. So therefore, he is a very, very good vehicle for talking about the state of the nation, you know? And so lots of very interesting things have been done with him to talk about and address this complex problem going back to the beginning of this interview when we were talking about Wonder Woman and identifying America as peace, the sort of difference between the peace-loving America of its, to some extent, that it practices, but also as an ideal, and then this kind of extremely violent, forceful America that just imposes itself on every nation around the world,
Yeah.
And Captain America kind of becomes a barometer, for those shifts, or the way America accents its ideal side or its kind of political realist side,
Yes.
So he's very useful and very, very interesting for that, I think, and he's been used in a number of ways like that. I mean, the great example was when he actually stopped being Captain America and he became Nomad.
Yeah.
I mean, what's brilliant about that, what's beautiful about that was the point of Nixon and Watergate, right? Yeah. He actually found the secret society in the White House, right? Practically in the Oval Office. And he had this existential crisis and his world fell apart, right? And he became this hero called Nomad, which is a sort of a man without a home, right? He was completely destroyed. And it was a sort of a really great statement on the existential condition of America, as everybody was wondering, who are we, and what sort of country are we, and what are we doing,
It's quite extraordinary to think back to that time and how the idea of a criticism of the Nixon post-Watergate White House it was made more ridiculous for the purpose of the comic book. So there was a lot of brainwashing going on. There's a lot of people, the public representatives being, brainwashed into being villains for this secret empire and all the rest of it. So they've made it comic booky, whereas we seem to be living in an age now where the extremes of that comic book of Steve Englehart's scripts, they don't even match what we're currently living through right now.
Well, it's gone the other way, hasn't it?
Yeah.
You look at the absurdity of Trump, and the absurdity of Trump, that would be in the sort of Captain America sort of mad bomb story, which is what you're talking about, these kind of devices that make everybody mad. And you look at America now and you think, well, the whole country must be under some kind of spell by some strange alien manipulator to have President Trump as the president, right? And the comics are almost realistic compared to the reality of politics, right? Whereas what you were saying was the comics used to sort of dress up, used to talk about the situation, but they dressed it up in exaggerated sort of fantasy clothes. But it's like the reality now is the fantasy, and the comics are kind of, it's just, I don't know, it's just, it's insane. It's utterly insane. I'm left speechless, really, trying to think about it.
I don't know what you thought of even the memifying of Richard Spencer getting punched in the face. And I've seen illustrations comparing it with Captain America punching out Nazis. And of course, again, Captain America has been brought to bear on this image, this idea of a Nazi being punched in the face.
Yeah. Well, I think people who are promoting genocide or advertising an ideology of genocide ought to be punched in the face,
Do it for Jack Kirby.
Yeah, I mean, I would find it. I mean, I'm not a violent man. I'd find it hard to actually punch Richard Spencer in the face. But the point is, this is a man who's promoting an ideology that's premised on supremacy and mass murder. And the problem with the rise of Nazism in the start was that they were partly elected and then took the rest of it by force. And really they were allowed to do that because nobody could believe it was happening. I tell you what, the book to read, the book for today, is a play by Max Frisch. In German it's called Biedermann und die Brandstifter, which means Biedermann and the fire raisers or fire starters, right? And it's about these two guys who move into Biedermann's house. They're like renting out the top floor or something, or a room. And they gradually ingratiate themselves into other parts of the house to the point where they actually get to use his own personal bathroom and stuff, right? And Biederman is sort of suspicious of them, but he can't believe they're bad, right? Until at the end, they're actually taking a barrel of oil up the stairs to the top of the house. And he says to them, "What are you doing?" And they say, "We're going to burn your house down." And he just laughs and says, "Oh yeah, of course you are." You know? Because he can't believe they're going to do it.
Yeah.
And they just burn his house down. And it's this idea that you cannot believe what you're seeing, right? That somehow it's not actually what your eyes are telling you it is, right?
Yeah.
And then the next day your house is burned down, right? And that's kind of where we are. And that's sort of what the comics are trying to talk about. And of course, what's interesting about Captain America, they talk about Captain America in 1941 as a wartime Cap. And of course, the war was on, but America wasn't in the war. Right? 1941, Captain America #1 was created in order to encourage support for intervention.
Yes.
Right? So that punch on Hitler from Captain America, you could almost argue as a kind of preemptive thing, right? He's not actually, America are not at war. He's not at war with Hitler, right? But he still punches him in the face because he knows what he's up to and he knows what he means, right? So people are saying, well, punching Nazis in the face is okay during wartime, but not in peacetime, right? We mustn't do it in peacetime. Nick Spencer recently referred to issue 275, right, where Cap, I think there's a Nazi speaking at some rally, and this Jewish guy sort of tries to sort of violently take him down, and Cap stops him and says, "No, we mustn't use violence. We must be peaceful," and so on and so forth, right? And Nick Spencer's saying, "Well, this is what Cap would do about this, right? Because Nick Spencer doesn't want people punching each other."
Yeah.
But the funny thing is, you've got to remember that Nick Spencer's now made him a Nazi, right? So you can't sort of say, well, this is what Cap would have done, because now we know that back then he was a Nazi. That's the whole point of the current story, right? So it problematizes stuff like that. But
Nick Spencer's wandered into a bit of a hall of mirrors there. I'm not really sure what he was thinking. But
yeah, he has, and I sort of feel sorry for him because he had this. I think he was sort of partly in that sort of Biederman moment where he thought, well, I can write this story about sort of Cap Trump Nazi because actually it won't happen, and then I can sort of write my way out of it. And I think now that it has happened, it's quite different, right? But Cap has always fought against sort of Nazis, but not just Nazis, a kind of excessive patriotism and a sort of militant nationalism. He's always been opposed to that. That was the great thing when he was brought back in '64. Was this sort of man out of time or whatever? He's still a Second World War character. But what Stanley did when he brought him back was he made him a person that was sort of represented the ideals of what America could be, right? Yeah. So there was always this Cap sort of walked this gap between what America does and what it wants to do, right? Between what it is and what it says it's going to be. And in the gap between those things, a lot of stuff can fall through and a lot of storytelling can take place, right? So Cap, for me, people talk about him as the American ideal. I've said in the book, the chapter on him in the book, that he represents more of the what Hannah Arendt called the promise, right? He represents what America has promised, and he also represents what it's lacking, right? So there's all these instances where he loses his uniform or he loses the title because he refuses to do what the government want him to do, which is why right-wingers love him as much as left-wingers, right? Because Cap doesn't identify with the government, right? He represents something that's transcendent You know, he represents the people, freedom, the dream, the promise, or whatever. And so that's why he can be used for some really, really interesting ideas. And of course, there's numerous examples of these mad nationalists and patriots that he's fought, because his patronym, right, the fact that he defends America all the time would suggest that he's right wing, but of course he's not. He was brought back by Stan Lee as a New Deal Democrat, right? He's not a Republican. He's not a conservative. He's socially liberal, right? Mm. He was the person that Scarlet Witch and Vision went to get support to get married, right? You know, he's not exactly a conservative, right? You got this witch and a kind of synthezoid saying, look, we want to get married and have some babies, and Cat's like, yeah, whatever, man. That's cool. So he's kind of socially liberal in that sense. So they've to show his politics, to show his liberalism, and the fact that he's not an arch nationalist despite his name. They pitted him against all these different characters, right? We've had him up against Nuke, who first appeared in Daredevil in '86, I think, issue 230 or something, 232.
He's the one who has the American flag actually tattooed onto his face.
Yeah, and he's a very, very violent, mentally deranged veteran who's controlled with pharmaceuticals by his handlers. And Cap says in that comic that he hates him because he wears the Stars and Stripes on his face. That's why Cap hates him, right? Because he's so identified with America, but he doesn't represent anything that America represents for Steve Rogers, right? Around the same time, there was that amazing story written by Mark Gruenwald, I think, which was collected together as just called The Captain.
Oh, right, yeah, so the black uniform, when it goes black.
Yeah, yes. He was just a captain, yeah. Not Captain America at all, right? Just a captain in a black uniform. And he was replaced by John Walker, the super patriot, right? Who later became US agent. And that was precisely that. He left because the government wanted him to do stuff that he didn't want to do, right?
I have this vivid memory of reading West Coast Avengers, I think it was.
Yeah.
With John Byrne, and it was John Walker. But I didn't know that as a kid. So I was really confused as to why Captain America was being so mean all of a sudden.
Yeah, well, US agent, John Walker, US agent, is a Captain America for Tories.
Exactly. But like, what interesting to me is the appearance and the costume of Captain America to me is synonymous with good character.
Yeah.
So even though somebody
generally wears black, doesn't he?
Yes. So I was like, oh, he's changed his look a bit, but it's him. But no, it was a completely different person. He just happened to be wearing the same costume.
Yeah.
And I was alarmed as a kid because I was going, oh, Captain America has become mean. So it seems it's a recurring idea.
What's interesting about US Agent, though, he's sort of hero anti-hero type, right?
Yeah.
Because there's still an element in him that's really good, right? He still wants to work for the same ideals. He's just a bit mad.
And he's a bit gullible. He follows orders a little bit.
Yeah, right. So he doesn't quite have the capacity for independent thought and assessment, and he doesn't have sort of the nuanced kind of moral radar that Steve Rogers has. But in his heart, he wants to do the best. I mean, it's what's lovely about that whole run called The Captain. He's as Super Patriot all the way through. He's thinking, oh my God, once he becomes Captain America, he's like, shit, this really is difficult, right? His first response is to just smash everybody who isn't American, right? And then he's realizing it's much more difficult than that. And he fails ultimately because he can't get out of this spiral of revenge, right? Yeah. He's just locked into this revenge cycle, which again is a really excellent critique of American foreign policy, that it's just somebody does something and you revenge and you hit back and then the whole cycle just starts again. So he's quite interesting because he has this capacity to sort of know what he ought to do, but he doesn't have the capacity to actually execute it, right? So he's not a bad guy. It's just that his militant patriotism kind of clouds him and blinds him and makes him do things that are really not advisable. And so Captain America has to come in and eventually take him down, right? And they call him back up because John Walker can't do it. And even earlier than that, probably the most important one, the best one, was when they brought William Burnside in, who became known as Bad Cap.
Okay.
Right. This was 1972, I think.
Okay. Is he the one who was from the 50s?
Yeah, because what happened, Captain America finished in the late 40s as a comic because people were no longer interested in superheroes, right? And war stories. And actually Stan Lee was one of the people who tried to bring him back in the 50s.
Yep.
1953, they brought him back as a commie smasher. Cap the Commie Smasher, right? So they tried to recreate the kind of World War thing against the Nazis, but now it was the communists. But that didn't last very long. And of course, like sort of nature that abhors a vacuum, right? Superhero universes abhor kind of gaps in continuity. And so he was brought back by, he was written by Steve Englehart, I think. And the story is that the 1950s Cap, the commie smasher, who was completely mad, was actually a fan of Steve Rogers. And when Steve Rogers went missing after the war, he thought America needed a captain, right? So he had plastic surgery to make himself look like Steve Rogers, and he stole a vial of the super soldier serum and injected it with him and became super strong, but he didn't have the Vita rays, this essential, another kind of deconstruction term is the supplement, right? He didn't have this sort of supplementary thing of the Vita rays which balanced him out. So he was a bit of a nutter. So what they did, they rounded him up as Captain America and sort of locked him away and put him on ice. And what happened was somebody released him in 1972. And he came back and he wanted to take out Steve Rogers as a sort of wet, liberal, pinko, libtard type, right? And he had Jack Monroe as his Bucky. And Sam Wilson, because Steve Rogers was on vacation in the time in the comic, and Sam Wilson knew something was wrong because this Captain America referred to him as boy.
Yeah.
Right? And Steve Rogers would never refer to Sam Wilson as boy.
Yeah.
So anyway, he just started beating the shit out of everybody, anybody that was remotely not American in his version, which was hyper-conservative, right, and hyper-nationalistic. Anybody that was remotely liberal was just a communist. And so he just ran around kicking the shit out of people. And Captain America, Steve Rogers, had to come back and take him out and put him back on ice, right? But he then turned up in a later story, that National Force story we were talking about before. William Burnside became the Grand Director and led this kind of neo-Nazi group called the National Force. And again, Captain America had to take him down. His probably best appearance and the ultimate comic for the age of Trump, which is What If, number 44, I think, which is What If America Was Revived Today, and that came out around 84, 85, 86. And what happened was Captain America Steve Rogers wasn't discovered until the 1980s in this story. And so all that time, Bad Cap, right? Again, Bad Cap was brought back, and he enabled basically a Nazi senator to become the president. And in that comic, you've got Harlem is put up behind a wall, poverty in Harlem. Everybody has an identification card to stop immigrants from taking jobs. Honestly, if you want to read a comic about Trump, it's the most prescient comic, and it was written, 30 years before Trump appeared, right? Yeah. And What If 44, I think it is. But that's amazing, and sort of so Burnside's in there, as this is what happens to America if it becomes overtly nationalistic and militantly patriotic in a very, very reductionist sense, or uses its own brand of identity politics, the sort of white supremacist, white nationalist thing. So Cap's always had to fight these arch nationalists that verge on fascists or actual Nazis, right? Because he's constantly telling, the message constantly is that Captain America, despite his name, is not a nationalist, right? He's not America first. He's actually a cosmopolitan. There's that great story where he fights the Flag Smasher. Right, the Flag Smasher is probably my most favourite villain of all time. Right, he's this anarchist who wants to destroy all nations because he thinks it's the cause of war. So the way to bring peace to everybody is to destroy nations. Right, he just happens to do that by starting wars. Right,
yeah,
which is a bit funny, but there's a great bit in there where him and Cap sort of face off, and the only thing that differentiates them is the fact that the Flag Smasher uses violence to get to achieve his ends, right? Cap, where the Flag Smasher is talking about anarchism and destruction of nations, Cap's talking about internationalism, cosmopolitanism, and sort of world unity, but a unity of differences. Do you know what I mean? And that's what Cap is. He's the America that stands for the sort of universal human rights. Okay, he's not the America that puts America first. He defends the America that wants to protect universal human rights and freedoms. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
That's who Steve Rogers is. The ideological thing, the patriotic thing, is that America is the strongest nation, the most able nation to secure and defend those universal human rights. But it's not about America itself, right? It's a sort of civilizing mission, a mission of progression for the entire world, right? And it's sort of pretty much America's role to deliver that, which is where it becomes quite problematic. But that's why Cap isn't a nationalist per se, and why he's not right wing, and why he's not America first, And we know that America first is the slogans of neo-Nazis and right wingers from way back. Kirby actually complains, right, when they put out Captain America #1. He actually says that he was attacked by the America Firsters.
They turned up the building, yeah.
Yeah, and another group called the German American Bund. Right? These were Nazis who came and protested against the publication of Captain America 1 because they didn't like the representation of Hitler.
Yeah.
Right?
So if you're interested in a podcast discussion of that, The Dollop just did an episode all about the German-American summer camps, which was sort of breeding ground for young Nazis at that time. So if you're interested, it turns out they were quite popular. It's worryingly popular.
Yeah, no, it's frightening stuff. But this is the danger of that, right? This is the danger that we're living in a world that's quite fragile. Feels quite precarious on lots of fronts. We've had the financial crisis, we've got wars, we've got problems over resources, we've got climate change, we've got a neoliberal economy that's only working for the very top, right? That everybody's wages are stagnating, or their jobs are becoming, short-term contracts or something. What's so dangerous about that is that any ideology of hate is very, very powerful, because hate as an emotion is immediately empowering, right? If I love somebody, I'm dependent upon them returning their love to me, really, right? It's a risky thing. I'm risking myself by admitting, that I love somebody. It's a risk. I'm having to go outside of myself in the hope that somebody will bring me back to myself and say, I love you too, right? And when that happens, that's very, very powerful. But hate doesn't need another person. It doesn't need the person to return you to yourself, right? You can just hate anybody, and you immediately feel powerful, right? If there's that big expanse of self, right? I hate you. I fucking hate you. And and the other person doesn't have to return anything. And in fact, the less the person returns, the more strong you feel, right?
Yeah.
So at a time when everything is very precarious and risky and people are nervous and anxious about what's happening, somebody comes along immediately with an easy solution and says it's that person's fault, right, who's generally lower down the sort of social ladder than you are, and I now say that it's legitimate for you to hate them. And you immediately feel good, right? I can hate that black man because I'm a white man, right? It's what Freud said about the Roman plebeian, right? As long as the plebeian is Roman, it can still feel good about itself because it's got the slaves to kick down on. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So the Roman plebeian can still be treated like shit, but as long as it's Roman, right?
It's got
something to feel good about, and it can hate the slave, right, and the foreigner.
We still see that today. We still see that today with the notion of class as well. You still got, well, at least I'm not poor and black, I'm poor and white. Exactly. I've got that,
Yeah, exactly. So it's a very powerful emotion. It's very dangerous at the moment, that these politics are around. These politics are very, very seductive at the moment, right?
Yep.
Very seductive. But I mean, what's great about America, of course, is that the vast majority of people are not falling for it. Right?
Yeah, that's encouraging.
He's basically got there because he's got this really right-wing media, and even the liberal media there haven't really engaged with politics for a long time in any critical sense, right? And voter suppression, voter apathy, whatever, but the vast majority of people are very anti-Trump. So there's still hope for America. The worst thing that can happen for America is he got another 4 years after this, and then we are in very dangerous territory. Right?
Yes.
He's already showing quite dictatorial.
Well, we're barely out of the week. It's already looking pretty bad.
Coming up, the problem with Nick Spencer's take on Cap in the age of Trump. Why anti-Trump people need not boycott Marvel, even if the company's CEO is a Trump associate, and more. But first, if you value the content on Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and To the Bat Polls, and want to help us move up to bigger and better things, how about donating a few bucks a month via Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics? Or you can make a one-time donation via PayPal. Send it to donate@deconstructingcomics.com.
I'm Batman.
And I'm Robin.
This is Tim.
And this is Paul. To the Bat Polls!
The iTunes reviews are in on To the Bat Polls podcast. These guys do a good job, writes Acello. Who knew that the Batman TV show was such a wellspring of insight into Hollywood trivia, 60s counterculture, sexual mores, and even musical analysis? The Young brothers know their stuff, says Professor Allen. It is a great mix of nostalgia, analysis, and fun. Highly recommended. You've heard the reviews, now try it for yourself. New episodes on the first, third, and fifth Thursdays of the month on iTunes or Stitcher, or at tothebatpolls.libsyn.com.
Batman, the answer to a policeman's prayer.
For nostalgia, analysis, and fun, it's
To the Bat Polls.
Getting back to Captain America, I suppose the difficult thing for me is that once Nick Spencer had done this, I thought, yeah, this is great. This is a fantastic, brave thing to do. And then once Trump was elected, it was like, well, actually, I've kind of changed my mind about this because it's becoming really problematic now. Because, A, you've got a Cap that the white supremacists can admire because he's a Nazi. You can't go back and say, well, this is the model that Cap used to be, and this is what we should use, because now we know he was a Nazi all the time, right? So it kind of eradicates all of that sort of stuff. And also, I think this sort of othering of Cap, turning him into the exact opposite of what he used to be, is actually too much. And it puts people off. And a lot of people, not people on the left necessarily, but certainly people on the right who might have been open to this engagement with fascism, right, are turned off by it. So I think a much more successful example, I think, is John Reber's New Deal, which came out in 2002. So this is just a year after September the 11th and the Twin Towers and stuff. And it's a story where it's like, oh my God, there's Cap at ground zero, and here's the box cutters and people on the plane, and here's the sort of Al-Qaeda screaming, shouting and cheering, and you're thinking, oh God, this is totally predictable and boring. But then what happens is Cap gets called out to a terrorist attack in a place called Centerville, which is obviously like just the center of America, right?
Yeah, generic sounding, yeah.
Yeah, Middle America.
Yeah.
And there's these Islamic terrorists who are trying to take over this town. And so he starts to fight them. And as he's fighting them, he realizes they've all got prosthetic arms and legs. And he's trying to work out why. And they sort of tell him that they've had all their arms and legs blown off by the munitions that Americans have left behind in previous wars. And so there's this amazing kind of critique of American foreign policy, right, in this story about the war on terror and Ground Zero. And I think it's probably one of the most profound engagements with American foreign policy. And it actually the story finishes with Cap, obviously the World War II hero, reflecting on what the Allies did to Dresden. Basically saying, if you think what happened to the World Trade Center is a crime, you have a look at what we did to Dresden, right? And it's that kind of storytelling which I find is really interesting, because you go with Cap, like you were saying earlier with the priest story, right? You're kind of locked into thinking this is going somewhere. And you can, even if you're reading it from the right, it's like, yeah, good, this is all what I want to see, right? And then suddenly it starts to sort of do this turn. It just starts to sort of bear off to the left.
Yeah.
And becomes this really, really profound critique, and very, very brave. I mean, this is a year after the destruction of the World Trade Center. So I'm worried that having turned Cap into a Nazi is just too much. And while it started off as a radical political gesture within the comics, it's actually meant that Captain America now can't do anything. Right? It's left up to Sam Wilson, because there's 2 Captain Americas at the moment. Well, there's 3 if you count the woman who's just turned up in US Avengers, right?
Yeah.
But so it's left to Sam Wilson to be the kind of critic of Trump, and he's doing very well in terms of issues around Black Lives Matter and these murdering robots called the Americobs. So he's trying to deal with the sort of Black Lives Matter issue and the whole thing about racism and people not recognizing him as Captain America because he's black, and the hashtag Take Back the Shield. But I think that if Steve Rogers was still Steve Rogers and not the Nazi, then there could be a very powerful 2-pronged critique of Trump. And at the moment, apart from, Red Skull turning up, I think in issue 7 of Steve Rogers' Captain America, where Red Skull's just ranting about taking down the establishment, right? So Red Skull takes up this position of Trump. You have those moments in the comic, but sadly, Captain America seems to be off the field, right? He's kind of out of the game almost now. And that's a very bad place to be, when you need him to be offering the regular critique that he's offered, throughout his career. So I've sort of checked, not that I don't think it was a great and sort of brave decision and a great comic when he brought back Steve Rogers as a Hydra agent. I just, on reflection now, he seems to have, for a very political writer, he seems to have much less scope now.
He's painted himself into a corner.
He's painted himself into a corner. Yeah.
I want to read. Was it yourself? Did you actually write the sort of replacement for Hail Hydra with that piece of text? Was that you, or is that something you?
Yeah,
found?
that was me. Yeah.
I just want to read this out because I was quite taken, and I remember when you first started talking about this, and we exchanged a couple of notes, and you were quite troubled by the storyline and the response to the storyline, because, as you say, Captain America is always being used to critique what Captain America is in relation to America.
Mm.
So I just want to quote this bit. I am a metaphor, a literary allusion to the proximity of fascism to our political system. Don't panic. Just think about it. That's all I ask. And I thought that was very good take on it, because you're sort of asking the readership, wait until the full story's in.
Yeah.
What's amusing to me now about that, because we all were like, yes, let's actually just see where Nick Spencer's taking this. And a lot of people were saying, no, this is a stage too far. You've gone too far with this. You can't do this to Cap. There's an echo of that with Trump, because when Trump was elected, one of the catchcalls was, give him a chance.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh wait, no. It's gone too far. It's gone too far.
Yeah. The slight difference is there, we can give the writer a chance to develop a story in a fictional world where Captain America's a Nazi. But the idea that you'd give an actual Nazi who's taken over the White House a chance to prove himself is it's of a qualitatively different order. Right?
I don't want to sink this podcast by introducing a completely different element again, but I was listening to an interview with Slavoj Zizek, who is sticking to his guns on the whole being taken out of context when he said, I hope Trump wins. But one of the points, he insists that in his view, Trump is not a fascist. He insists because I think what it comes down to for him is he has no ideological ground whatsoever. He's a stuffed shirt. There's nothing there.
Yeah.
He just reacts to things. And it just happens that's very beneficial to the fascist outlook. So Zizek seems to have this problem between distinguishing between a person who's actually a fascist and then a person who enables fascism.
Yeah, I think Trump is an enabler of fascism to some extent, but I think he is rooted in a white supremacism and a misogyny and a hatred of the state, right? He does believe, and Steve Bannon's the same, right? I mean, Zizek's a Leninist, and Zizek says, this is a great time for us, because he thinks in terms of Lenin, right? That the world's in chaos, this is a great opportunity, right?
Yeah.
But what Zizek fails to mention all the time is that Steve Bannon is also a Leninist. Right? He's just a right-wing Leninist.
Yeah.
And Steve Bannon is trying to create the chaos that will create the opportunity for really the emergence of a corporate state, where corporations can take over every aspect of the state and what was state provision and public provision, right? But I don't accept that Trump is just somebody that's being used. I agree that he is being used by people, but Trump is driven by supremacist beliefs, right? He believes he's genetically superior to lots of people. He's talked about that on a number of occasions. His supremacism, both in terms of genetics and in terms of white nationalism. I mean, his father had strong links to the KKK, I believe. I think there is an ideology in there, and it's an ideology that would build a corporate state based on an American national identity that's dominated by a white establishment, and that puts women in their place, and of course black people. So I do think there's an ideology there. It may not be worked out. He might not be capable of writing Mein Kampf.
Which, right? Who knows who wrote that? Because there's
but even so, I don't think the art of the deal is quite that. But I think to just talk about Trump as a businessman, as an opportunist, I think really misses the point.
Yeah.
and that's what concerns me about a lot of this, because I think, again, we get back to the sort of that Biederman story, that people can't quite believe what they're seeing, and they'd rather think it's not happening than actually believe what they're seeing, right? And I suppose getting back to the topic of Captain America, was Captain America would regularly try and let people know that actually the country's sort of going down the wrong route, Yeah. I mean, that time when he retired and John Walker took over, that was shortly after they started funding the Contras in Nicaragua, I think. And it was a time in which there was a real push in terms of covert foreign policy to sort of take over and influence all kinds of countries. Of course, it's a great irony that now, Trump's supposed to be the puppet of Russia, given the history that America's had in kind of interfering with other governments. So, yeah, I think that we need Steve Rogers to get back onto the field somehow, and I don't know how Nick Spencer's going to do it. He was tweeting yesterday saying there was some big Marvel news out today. I don't know if that would have any bearing on it. I haven't had time to look at that because I've had such a mad day at work. But yeah, I'll have to catch up with that. But we sort of need sort of Cap back, I think.
I think we're going to wrap it up shortly, I think, because we've been quite wide-ranging in our discussion, and I don't want us to get completely lost. But speaking of Marvel and Nick Spencer, whatever his political critique that he was trying to mount, Hydra Cap won Marvel a lot of press. It's shifted a lot of units. A lot of people bought that first issue with the Hail Hydra announcement. So clearly this is a commercial concern. That's what they do. They sell copies. I'm interested in how the publisher, which has so many characters that were, as you say, introduced by Stan Lee with a sort of critical element in them. Captain America is New Deal Democrat. Iron Man feels quite bad about being a weapons dealer. Black Widow was a Soviet. Double Agent 2 is actually depicted in a very sympathetic light for that time. You've had this history of Marvel being quite politically astute with some of its writers, like Steve Englehart, and I would argue more recently Al Ewing. And yet, the CEO of Marvel has been tapped to enter the Trump administration. So you've got Marvel with all its liberal credentials. The profits it's earning telling these stories are going towards a man who is now sitting at the same table as the person who's anti-science, anti-climate change, somewhat suspect on racial diversity, on the UN, on any sort of pluralism, Mr. Perlmutter, who is actually going to be sitting down with this man. So where does that leave us? Should we be not purchasing Marvel comics for the reason that their money is actually going towards a man who is politically on the right with Trump?
Yeah, that was my first response when I heard that story. It's like, how can I buy this stuff anymore? But if we stop buying the likes of Nick Spencer and Al Ewing, and if we stop, unfortunately, if we don't buy comics like Mockingbird and A-Force, they get pulled, they get cancelled.
Yeah.
The thing is, if we don't buy, if the sort of people who are upset by Trump, and I think his name's Ike Perlmutter, is it? Perlman? If we're upset by that, we'll probably be buying the comics that are supporting kind of diversity in the industry, right? I would imagine, right, that people on the left, particularly Marvel readers, are sort of picking up a lot of the comics that are pushing the envelope in terms of diversity. If we stop buying, the sort of the readers who are more on the right won't stop buying their comics, and Marvel will return to or focus on more sort of violent vigilantes, nationalistic heroes, or maybe just complete and utter sort of fantasy and farce, right? Escapism. So it wouldn't stop the funding of Trump necessarily, right? It would just change the nature of the comics. And I think while Marvel are putting out those stories, they are still important stories for people to engage with. And I think it's a complex situation, but we're almost obliged to buy them and support them. Because if you think about it, in terms of consumption, virtually everything we do is bad for something, right?
Yeah.
We're locked into all kinds of patterns of consumption that are really, really damaging and really, really problematic, socially, politically, environmentally, culturally. So, we have to be aware of what we're purchasing. But, boycotts aren't necessarily going to change things. Marvel will just publish different books, and maybe the diversity line was just it will go down as an experiment in Marvel's history, right? That didn't work. And I suppose it's like the difference between, you might talk about the community of scholars in a university, and the university is an institution, right? Your institution might be doing some things that you don't agree with, some deep problematic things, but you've still got your community of scholars, your peers and your colleagues that you need to talk to, and part of that community of scholars is the students. And that's a really sort of sacred relationship, and all kinds of magical and wonderful things can happen amongst that, and you have to stick to your principles and do what you want to be doing despite what the institution is doing, right? And it's the same for these writers. They have these opportunities to write and tell stories, and they've got to do it. What better place to do it in these massive multi-million selling comics, So they have to sort of keep at it. It's a sort of a conundrum, really. I think it doesn't have an easy answer, but this guy, he's probably not going to be around that long. Marvel Comics is going to be around a lot longer. And I just think the general cultural mood is to move away from that. I firmly believe, I hope. I think this is the last stand of white male privilege. There is a tide, a social, cultural, political tide turning against white male privilege. And this is the last stand, hopefully.
Yeah.
And it will be washed away. And so I think the push of diversity in Marvel will outlive Perlmutter, or whatever his name is, right?
That's the man. And I think what's relevant there is how fantastic it was to see people on the streets, as opposed to the loudly magnified shrieks online when you've got a minority who like to abuse or like to harass or like to pursue men or women who don't agree. With seeing those women marching on Washington and all around the world, to me felt like that was a milestone.
It was fantastic.
Yeah.
What we need to now make sure is that if there's any, some of the sort of more politically active people in the Women's March movement make connections with the Black Lives Matter movement, right?
Yeah.
And so we get this kind of intersectional response, right, where people do actually start having some joined up thinking about this, because that's the only way to do it. But the other thing, going back to the Marvel thing, is I imagine, most of the executives and most of the staff at Marvel are not Trump supporters, right? So do you withdraw funding from all of them as well, just because?
Yeah, you're punishing everyone.
A notable one of them is a Trump supporter, you know.
Yeah.
So it's a problem, but you know, in any walk of life, no matter where you are, you will find someone that's particularly unpleasant. You know, and you can't stop what you're doing just because there's one unpleasant person. In fact, if something positive is happening around that person, you've got to keep supporting that. Make sure that outlives him.
So buy diverse comics and make diverse comics.
Well, the next one that comes out on the America tip is America Chavez, right? She's about to get her own title. And it's being written by a gay Latina woman, right?
Yeah.
Buy it. If you're anti-Trump, right? We want gay Latino women called America, right? And with a surname like Chavez, right? Who's been the enemy of the American right for so long. It's just the perfect anti-Trump comic.
Yeah.
And it's not a stunt, right?
Yeah.
It's written by a woman who Trump supporters would like to exterminate.
Yeah.
So go and buy it.
Very good.
It's going to have one of the best covers ever. I've seen I don't know if the original cover or the variant, but it just looks absolutely fantastic.
Great stuff. I think that's where we ended on Miss America Chavez. I think that's the way to go.
Go America.
Thanks to Emmet and Neal for this week's episode. You can write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or look up Deconstructing Comics on Patreon, Twitter, Tumblr, Facebook, and YouTube. All our social media links can be found on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. Also, please give us a review on iTunes or Stitcher. Our theme is from bensound.com. Last Thursday on To the Bat Polls, Paul and I talked about the 1943 Batman movie serial. How did it influence the 1966 series? Look up To the Bat Polls wherever you find your podcasts or at tothebatpolls.libsyn.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com, and please try to keep it to about 30 pages. A new episode is coming up this Thursday here in this podcast feed. Unusually, it's about a Dark Horse book written by a successful novelist. Is this writer's first comic also a success? Listen on Thursday and find out. Next week on this podcast, a Tokyo-based artist named Oscar, who made the comic called Kai that we discussed on Critiquing Comics episode 100. We'll talk about his journey to being a better self-promoter. Also, Mulele will be here to talk about his own approach to getting comics printed in a way that they look their best, some of which has rubbed off on Oscar. How have both Mulele and Oscar been inspired by Natalie Andreessen's Swim Team Superstar? Find out next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.